So, are, I didn't really think about this when they were talking about Swift last week, but now you can use emoji in your code, Bill. Isn't that going to be awesome? Like you could literally, like, developers like to have lots of scatological terms. You could literally have an object that was a steaming pile of poo. Like, now it's not just something that people verbalize. It'll be great. There is a new era upon us.
I'm all for progress.
Exactly. I think it's going to be wonderful. Like, there's this example I'll put in the show notes that's sort of like, you can use the symbol pi for pi, and you could have a variable that's a dog cow, that's a dog cow picture. Now, on the other hand, I was looking at this and I was thinking, you being, in the same area of programming languages, I'm sort of a subset. Like, wasn't there Unicode in Java, and there still is? So in theory, in Java code, you could write in whatever, wacky character sets you wanted to.
Maybe, but I think the thing I've experienced is whenever you start programming, you internalize the constraints so much that you never ever go outside of those constraints. So I still make sure all my lines are less than 80 characters long, and I
Ah,
would
yes.
never dream of using Unicode. And so I think it may be possible, but it's for the youngins.
Yeah, it is like there's a conceptual sort of like epiphany you have when you realize there's two things, to your point. Like, one, you can have spaces in file names and directory names. This is kind of an old notion, but I'm still sort of like amazed when I make a
Right.
file name or a directory name that has a space in it. And then also, like, one that's really long, right? Like, just a very long descriptive one. And then also, with a funny name like mine, you can put accents and other characters in file names, which is equally sort of still amazing each time I do it. So, yeah, I'm assuming also in the operating system you could use emojis. You've got like a Yosemite beta running, right? Like, have you tried to put like a steaming pile of poop in there?
No, I'm just trying to make all my other normal programs function again.
So how is that working out, the Yosemite beta?
It's been okay. It definitely looks great. Like a lot of the apps I use, well, for work happen to be Java apps, and
Mm.
Apple hasn't. Well, it seems like they haven't really cared about Java for quite a while, so that was super painful to make work. And what else? Yeah, just some bizarre problems in third-party apps, but I knew what I was getting into. I mean, Pat Mueller's got the best approach. His approach is don't adopt any new, Apple OS until, .2 of the after it GAs. And of course, when you put on developer preview 2, you're just asking for trouble. But I just love that flat design, and I couldn't help myself.
Oh yeah. So other than the design, are there any highlights? Like, is the notification center blowing your mind or something? Or I
No,
barely remember all the stuff that came out, but it seemed interesting.
I think the two things I'm most interested in are the flat design, just because I like the way it looks, and then also the continuity stuff between iOS and
Mm.
Mac OS 10. But that would require installing the iOS beta on like my iPhone or something, and that just seems like a bad
Ah.
idea because yeah, I always think about the scenario where like the car breaks down and like some army of mutants on motorcycles attacks me, and I try to use my iPhone to call help, and it reboots continuously because I put on a beta. So the the iPhone, I never put the beta.
That is a concern. I will not be operational when the mutants attack.
Right. Well, I mean, with the Mac, in the worst case, you just restore your time machine backup, and you're back in business after a couple hours, and you take a break. But I mean, the phone is really a lifeline to a lot of things if you think about it.
You know what? This is a totally interesting rat hole, not related to anything, but I always think it's odd that they haven't built like virtual desktops into OS 10. Like, and it's equally odd that they haven't built that into Windows, as far as I know. Like, it just seems like that would be such a nice way, even if you're a non-tech person. It would be nice just to have that built in there, right? It's just, and like, mounting and handling ISOs is really difficult. Like, all that stuff is just like too hard. So, for example, when a beta comes out of whatever the loop Yosemite is, right? Like, it seems like you should just be able to, like, instead of having to get VMware Fusion or whatever, just, or I don't even know if you can do this, but just pop up a little like virtual instance to like mess around with it. Like, I don't really understand why that's not done on the desktop more.
Well, it wouldn't make sense for betas because the thing with the beta, you just put it on a non-critical machine and experiment with it to give feedback. It's not really intended to be used by users.
Oh, right. Well, I mean, on the other hand, like I'd like to use it, but like I'm worried about mutants, right? Like I just want to use it for pure entertainment value to see what it's like and poke at it. And I only have I'm not I don't have like the expense account for a fancy headset like you got there. You know, I've only got one Mac, and I've got an old Mac that like is on its last legs, but they wouldn't support it. But you know, it'd be fun just to like be able to run multiple instances, and the same thing in Windows, right? Like, you know, I'd like to run multiple versions of like Windows. Like when Windows 8 was coming out, when I was working at Dell, like I wanted to test it out, but it was sort of like, but I got to get this presentation done for tomorrow. So like I'm not gonna like do something damaging. It'd be nice just to like run it and test it out. And I don't know. It's always been weird to me. I mean, there's a whole like virtual desktop industry and market and all of that stuff, but it's weird that that's not just baked into every operating system nowadays.
Well, why would they do it? They're trying to reach a consumer mass market, and that's a super advanced edge case.
It's
hard to implement to boot.
Yeah, fair enough. It's not
Run
really
Linux.
worth it.
Run a,
Yeah.
you know what? Compile your own Linux kernel, and then I'm sure you could do lots of stuff like that.
Oh, compiling my own Linux kernel. I was like the only programmer ever who really didn't like Linux. Like it's just such a hassle compiling stuff all the time.
Yeah, I think it just has to do whether you want to sort of tinker with your system or whether you want to use your system to build stuff. And I've always kind of, well, most of my career been of the mindset, I just want the base system to be stable so that I could rapidly work on applications and stuff like that. Whereas I have friends who they love to tinker at the operating system level, just to understand how it works. That was never really that interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. Well, speaking of like tinkerers and people who do weird stuff, you're at Foo Camp this week. You've actually been there many, many years, right?
No. This is my second time. I was there the first time in 2012.
That's right.
And then last year I got invited, but we were having our baby, our third baby. And so, of course, that took precedence over Foo Camp, and they were gracious enough to re-invite me this year. And so, yeah, I'm sitting in O'Reilly headquarters in Sebastopol.
So what is Foo Camp for people who don't know?
Yeah, there's
myself.
Yeah, it's funny. I just read the Wikipedia article again because I knew you were probably going to ask me that. So oh god, it's kind of a convoluted story with lots of in-jokes. So like the whole thing about foobar in variable declarations.
Yeah.
Right? So then apparently Tim was talking to somebody about they had this phrase "foo" for Friends of O'Reilly, and they were joking that they should have at one of their conferences a foo bar where they serve drinks. Friends of O'Reilly bar, like for a meetup. And anyway, that snowballed into an idea that what if we held a conference where we invited Friends of O'Reilly who we thought were doing interesting stuff and do a unconference. Actually, you should probably check the Wikipedia article. I think the whole unconference approach, I think either Foo was one of the earliest adopters of it, or maybe even the sort of one of the things that kind of created the format. So
I mean, my history understanding, as explained to me by Simon Phipps, if you remember that guy at some point, was that sometime in the 90s, or in the days of Knights and Dragons, as it were, they used to have these open spaces conferences where it was not so much like the unconferences that we know nowadays, but like they would invite the audience to come up on a panel to talk to the audience, right? And of course, people have always congregated in groups and spoken with each other. That's not too normal. But it was sort of like a specific practice that people would have of like, here we are at a conference, we're going to make up a session. And then, I like yourself, I forget the exact history, but the idea of an unconference, I think, spread a lot from like Foo Camps, right? And people liked Foo Camps so much, and that started like in the early 2000s, if I remember. And they were, of course, like by design, sort of invite only, and whatever. And so people were like, oh, we really like Foo Camp, but we want to have like more of them. So continuing on your inside joke, they called them bar camps because, of course, bar comes after Foo, right?
Right. Yeah. Because there's like a bar camp RDU.
Right. And then so if you'll remember, in the mid 2000s, there were bar camps. Like there's probably even still barcamp.org, and it
Right.
was basically like a generic tech event, right? Like it wasn't specific to anything. It would just be like, come to the bar camp regionally and talk about tech stuff. And then
Right.
slowly but sure, like the history of bar camps in Austin is kind of like, and then there were like iPhone camps. There was like a enterprise systems management camp. You can imagine how thrilling that was. And nowadays, and in the same era, that the Uber concept of like an unconference emerged, and there was lots of hand wringing, very specific like doctrinarial, non-doctrinarial things around it, right? Like lots of manifestos and things. And then nowadays, I would say there's still camps and meetups, but there's things like, for example, DevOps days, which are basically an unconference, right?
Right.
It's
Right. Right.
actually a very much more structured unconference than an unconference, but I would
On
argue
a topic.
yeah, it's a direct descendant of what we're talking about here, of open spaces, foo camp, bar camp, unconference, and then DevOps. It's all sort of like the same thing.
Right. Yeah, and I have to apologize if I'm kind of low energy. You're talking a little bit slow. My flight, it's nice. There's one direct flight from Raleigh to San Fran, but it was delayed last night, so I got into San Fran at 11:30 local time, which is 2:30 my time, and then I had to drive to O'Reilly Land in Sebastopol, so I didn't get into my hotel until 4:30 a.m. my time.
Mm.
So I'm a little sleep deprived.
So what do they do at the foo camp nowadays?
Well, you pretty much explained it. It's a unconference, so they invite a set of people. I don't know how they select people. I think it's just people who they have interactions with throughout the year, who they think might, contribute some good topics or discussion points. And then I'm trying to think back to 2 years ago. So a few hours from now, I think we'll have a dinner, and Tim will kind of kick things off and talk about Foo Camp and the goals and the format and stuff like that. Oh, they got a cute term that I should share. Friend-EA, which is basically what's said at Foo Camp stays at Foo Camp unless you explicitly say, hey, could I write a blog about this or something? So the
Sure.
idea is that we can have fairly open discussions about the stuff that we're working on, which has various levels of sensitivity. And
Yeah.
then I think
Highly related to one of my favorite analyst constructs, the drink DA.
Yeah. And speaking of drinks, so then the next thing is tonight, the Foo Bar. So the Foo Bar is tonight. So they, because this is in wine country, right? Like 50 miles north of San Fran, and so they'll have some really nice wines and beers, and everybody, gets tipsy and mingles, and it's a fun way to kick things off. And then tomorrow, that's the real sort of the meat of the unconference. And then to a lesser extent Sunday. And tomorrow night is the what do they call those? The lightning talks or the excite talks or something?
Yeah, they're lightning.
Ignite.
Yeah.
So the Ignite talks are tomorrow night, and so that'll be fun.
You can be Saint Ignatius. See, that's
Right.
a joke for the people out there. Anyways, yeah, I did an Ignite talk once. Those are fun. Like
I think
at
I
the
saw
DevOps
you.
days, I think.
Yeah. I think I saw you give one at DevOps Days. That wasn't the Crowbar talk, was it? I think you did two
No,
talks.
no. The crowbar one was longer, and then I think I forget what I did an Ignite talk about. But anyways,
Yeah, I can't remember either, but I remember
I
I
think it
liked
was
it.
about converged infrastructure. How exciting is that?
I don't even know what it means.
Oh, Anyway, good point. Good point. So,
So actually, can I say one thing? It's
oh yeah,
really an
stay
important
free.
point. So if you can see me talk, I've got these really fancy, expensive headphones on, and the reason is because once again I lost my goddamn Apple EarPods. So I've started to get pinged and like hear that we have some listeners. So if anyone ever needs to send me a birthday or a Christmas present, just send EarPods. 'Cause
We could do a whole episode on Apple earphones. At the Kote Skotak house, we have maybe 5 or 10 pairs of them, right? And I probably even have a pair here. And look, see, they're quite remarkable. You can see that I have I've got this kind, right? Now, I think I've gone through 3 pairs of these, and it's not that I ever lose them, but they accidentally get put in the wash. Have you ever put your earpods in the wash? And the
yeah,
thing
no,
is,
my
they usually
EarPods suffer. Yeah,
they
they suffer
usually
all kinds of
survive.
deaths.
Yeah, mine usually survive. This is the first time we've put in earbuds or whatever the hell they're called in the wash probably 4 times, and every time you just wait a day and then they come out just fine. But this time they didn't come out fine. It's very upsetting, and it
Yeah.
is like not to be all audiophile like certain other podcasts, but like I don't care, right? Like I like the convenience and speaking of converged infrastructure, the full integratedness of those AirPod things, whatever
Right.
they are. And it is, I was amazed that when you plug it into your Mac, and also when I used a Dell XPS 13, like the mic works. It was like mind blowing that like this whole thing would work and you didn't need to have like a janky headset or whatever. It was actually pretty awesome.
Do you know the other thing it does that's just crazy, and I don't know how it does it? It somehow remembers the volume of the device that you were at. Because
Oh
I've actually
yeah.
had cases where, like, I plug in a different set of earphones, and the thing will play at a different volume, and when you plug in those, it like readjusts to the previous volume.
Yeah, and then you can use the volume and all the controls work. It's pretty cool.
And
Speaking of
now they
stuff.
now they acquired Beats, so who knows what kind of crazy
See,
headphones are going
and
to come out.
and why would you spend all your effort on that when you could instead put virtualization on the desktop, Bill?
Yeah. Well, if they ever have a management shakeup, maybe you'll be there.
So
You, it could be you bringing in the virtualized desktops and Syracuse bringing in the new file system.
exactly. So like I mean what's your what do you I haven't checked in sort of like the hipster O'Reilly world in quite some time. Like what are the things like O'Reilly Land is really interested in nowadays? There was in the mid 2000s they were kind of like one of the best sources for just what was happening in the open source world and LAMP stacks and the web and all of that. Like they were pretty hot and heavy there, but I'm not too sure what I'm not up to date on what they're Google about recently.
Yeah, well, they have a lot of conferences, and like for
Mm.
instance, next week in Santa
That's
Clara
true.
is the Velocity conference,
Yeah.
and so I kind of get it's hard to say. It'd be fun to ask. You know what? I should ask them how is their book business done with the emergence of things like Stack Overflow? Because
Yeah.
in the old days, the way I'd learn like a new programming language or a new system would be by the O'Reilly book. But when I was starting to do some Node.js programming a couple years ago, what I realized is I could type almost any question into Google. The first hit would be a Stack Overflow article, and the
Yeah.
first answer would be a voted up Stack Overflow answer, which was precisely the question I asked.
Yeah. It's I still, and maybe it's just because this is how I learned it. I don't know what the kids and their emojis are doing, but like I still like to have like a book that sort of like walks me through doing something. Like I don't like watching videos or searching through the web, but you're right. Like there was a whole they would call them cookbooks and other things like that, right? There was a whole
Right.
category of other books that I used every time I saw them, I would snatch them up, like just little kind of like 3 or 5 page puzzles that they would solve, like how to write an
Mhm.
RSS reader, and those were like those are always handy. And I guess nowadays a lot of that you just get through the web, and
Yeah, but one thought though, what's the difference between Amazon and a bookstore? The difference I find is that with Amazon, I just search for something and then I find it and then I buy it. Whereas with the bookstore, you kind of
yeah,
browse through it and you discover things that you maybe weren't necessarily looking for, but are relevant and interesting. And when I think about
that's true.
The Stack Overflow approach to programming, basically you say like, how do I implement an array in JavaScript or something, and of course Stack Overflow has an answer, and you're all set. Whereas, like, did you ever read that book that Tim actually himself wrote called the Unix Power Toolkit or something? You know what I'm talking
No,
about?
no, no, no.
It is really awesome. I mean, in some
That's
ways,
the
it's
one with the drill on the cover, right?
exactly, yeah. And it was like the book form of a wiki. Like it was prior to
Yeah.
wikis being popular, and you could just open that thing up to any page, and you would learn something useful, and it would have kind of references to other things that were useful. So I think in some ways, the Stack Overflow is great when you know the question you want to ask, but a book is great when there's just some topic area that you're saying, I want to learn about this, and I'm going to trust that the book author and the editor, have organized the information in such a way that it will answer questions
Yeah.
I don't even know I have.
No, I think you're right. It's like to use the Rumsfeldian quadrant of knowledge. It's sort of like, but books are good for known unknowns and unknown unknowns, right? Like
Right.
if you know what you're looking for, then it's not really like an issue. But anyway, no, I mean you're right. That used to be why I would always enjoy like looking through programming books and the kind of books that I read a lot of nowadays, like business and strategy books and history books, like are good for like. just getting an extensive treatment of some topic area. Now, like, we were talking about diffusion of innovation the other day, right? Like, you can't. There's really no Stack Overflow for that kind of stuff, right? Like, and
Right.
as you move up the stack, if you will, like more and more, it's I don't think anything has ever, remember the C2 wiki? Like, I don't think anything has ever kind of like superseded that body of knowledge, if you will. Like that used to be what you're describing of kind of meandering about in books and just learning things used to be what I would do on that C2 wiki a long time ago, right?
Right.
And you could kind of like learn the state of the agile programming world back then from just reading that wiki, and then also like get a wicked long list of books you should go read, right? But
Right.
like I feel like things are almost too big nowadays, right, in the internet to have that kind of community anymore for programming, and that's where I think I always like look to books to be helpful. Is like I I want almost like a single voice walking me through like learning about something, and that's also why like a lot of the podcasts that I like that aren't sort of like topical news ones, like more like the Critical Path podcast. Like a lot of why I like the way Horace does things is he's basically giving you lectures, right?
Right.
Like, and it's nice just to have like here's like the beginning, middle, and the end of a concept, and kind of just walking through it. And I think books are great for that kind of thing. And it is, we used to have when I was at Dell, we had a corporate Safari subscription, which was awesome except for one thing. It used corporate sign-on, so you could only read it on the corporate network, and it would drive me crazy, right? And you could only read it in the web browser, so you couldn't read it on your iPhone or your iPad. But that's the other dynamic that changes a lot is if you pay. I think a Safari subscription is like $300 a year or something like that. Whatever. I mean, it's one of those payments that's prohibitive. An individual has to think about it, more or less. But it's interesting that if you get sort of like a la carte access to books, when I would use it, I would notice that would change my reading behavior a lot as well, right? Because I would read different sections out of books a lot more, and the quality of content in books is, of course, generally a lot better than well, I shouldn't say that. It's consistently better than the quality of content that you find on the web. And so, I mean, that's the other thing I'm always interested in is like, it is kind of nice to have a paywall to encourage people to have more curated and higher quality stuff. I don't know what to do with it. I mean, I keep trying to get my current company to sign up for a Safari thing, but they keep not answering my email, which is a clever way of saying no.
Right.
But yeah, it is. I mean, I mean, while we're on the book topic, that's another thing in my reading behavior I've noticed. I don't know how you are, but like I've noticed a lot is I pretty much only read. I really want to read books on not my Kindle, but on my Kindle app now, like on my phone. Like I'm a lot fast. Like I can actually do it because it's like I don't. I usually whenever I have time to read a book, I don't have a book. Whereas
Right.
like having it on my phone is nicer. But I've noticed this. I don't know how to get over this, but I've noticed for like highly instructional and what I would call technical books, it's really hard to read on like in a Kindle on an online format, right? Because what I always want, like I'm reading this current book now called Stall Points, and it's like if you could imagine a mind map of like the 60 different ways that companies stall their revenue, like, and they've kind of intricately mapped out, like, one of them. I mean, it's like very complicated, and it's one of those books where, like, if I actually had the physical book, I would be flipping back and forth all the time to remember different things that I have read, which you can't really do with a Kindle, much to my consternation. So it
Mm.
is like very annoying.
Yeah, I actually have some really strange reading habits. So for conceptual books, I buy the audiobook from Audible, but then if
Mm.
it's really good, I buy the corresponding ebook, and I'll go for walks or clean the house or something and listen to the audiobook. And if they say something really interesting, I think of like two or three words that are probably unique out of the phrase. Then I take my iPhone out, search for it in the iBook, and then highlight it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So then over the course of time, even though I've never read the book, I've got a great set of notes on the
Yeah, no,
book for me.
and I mean that reminds me, like the last, one of the last big tech books that I bought is I bought that the continuous, integration and delivery book, and there was an option to buy the PDF and the actual book of it, which kind
Right,
of fits perfectly with how I would do it, right? Like you want to have like the ebook, so to speak, to just sort of casually read, and then the printed book for sort of like spatial referencing. And it's even nice to have the PDF because like that's a whole other form factor. Is like reading a PDF on like a big screen is a lot different than reading on a small screen. Is a lot different than reading a physical book. And
Yeah, and
I don't know.
that's the second weird reading habit. So if it's a book that's really good but really dense, like, a Clayton Christensen book, I actually sit in my home theater, project the ebook onto my home theater screen, and then play the audiobook and follow along, and then regularly pause. And I
Wow.
find that, well, it sounds weird, but it actually really helps with my comprehension of those really sophisticated topics. And also by sort of having the audio go and the video go, it keeps my mind from drifting. Because I don't know
Yeah,
about
yeah.
you, but when I read some of those really hard books, sometimes like I find that I've gone over two or three paragraphs and I haven't really read anything because I've been sort of trying to figure it out
Totally.
while
What's
my
our problem? Why does that happen? Like it's so weird that and I know I'll have read like 5 real pages or whatever and be like, oh, I have no idea what happened. I have to go back and read. Like
right.
I don't know how you hopefully there's some psychologists who have studied this, but you often hear from from me and other people that like this. I was just saying this to my wife Kim the other day that like I have to find this perfect type of music when I'm concentrating on something that's like it takes up that 10% of my mind that's not paying attention and distracts it. So the other 90% of my mind can pay attention. But if you like, for example, I can never listen to new music when I'm trying to work on something because I want to pay attention to the new music, and then I get
Right.
distracted from the core thing that I'm doing. So like, and I I, I think unfortunately like 70s yacht rock is the perfect type of music for me for that. Like I've heard all of those songs thousands of times and they're just barely entertaining enough that they like distract the distracting part of my mind. It's very
Yeah, I tend
weird.
to listen to like Daft Punk or like Philip Glass or something, like something
I was a
without
big Philip
words.
Glass. That's right. I'm gonna listen to sounds for airports.
Right, but you should try that. You should try that. Like play, just get the Audible book on your iPad, and then the
Yeah,
iBook or Kindle book, and then project it onto a TV or home theater or something. And
that's an
then it's
interesting
actually it's
idea.
sort of like how parents read to their kids, and the kids kind of follow along, and it helps with their comprehension. Maybe
Oh
it's
yeah.
something like that,
Huh.
sort of like the adult version of being read to.
So do they give you lots of fancy bags and gifts at this food camp, Bill? Are you gonna come out with like some funny stickers of animals?
I definitely get a T-shirt. I know that. But there's lots of swag hanging around, but I usually don't take it because I like to travel light. And the other thing I find is with swag, if it's not a T-shirt, it almost always just ends up in a closet, and then who needs more stuff in closets?
Oh yeah, yeah. I need to go through and sort through all my conference T-shirts. I did really well for several years. Like I would just not take the T-shirt, and then I'm wearing one of them now. People started making these like very comfortable gray T-shirts that you can wear as like undershirts, and so I would take them all the time. And now I can't close my drawer. It's tragic.
Right.
And I was even noticing I've got some shirts. I have like was it Google, Stack Driver is what Google bought, right? Like I've even gone through the phase now where I have shirts from companies that don't exist anymore.
Right. Yeah. Oh, one last thing on books. Speaking of books, did you ever read Steve O'Grady's The New Kingmakers?
Yeah, 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 definitely.
So that was a great O'Reilly book, and actually he's going to be here this weekend, so I'm hoping to get to see him.
Yeah, yeah. That was and I think it was like sponsored by New Relic or something, which is an
Yeah, it was
interesting
sponsored
funding
by. I
model.
think. Yeah, I think you could actually get it for free
Yeah,
somehow,
that's how
like
I got it.
the ebooks or
Yeah,
something.
and it is like this is ironically while we're just rambling on aimlessly about it. That's another interesting thing in books is the idea of like the 60-page book, which seems very appealing, right? Because like I said, I read a lot of business books, which are notorious for being about
300 pages or
yeah, for
350
being
pages.
exactly for being 300-page books that are 255 pages longer than they need to be. I think that joke would have been better 295 pages, but they're basically like 100-page books that are they could be 5-page articles.
No, actually, I got a better variation on the joke. It's 290 pages longer than the Harvard Business Review article that told you everything you needed to know.
Exactly, exactly. And and it kind of gets to this thing of like I think and this will allow me to throw out another old chestnut that my wife also reminded me of that I actually wrote a book once. But I think if everyone, the buyers, the writers, and the sellers reimagine books as basically they can be 60 pages, right? Then that would actually be really useful. But the problem is like, and here comes my anecdote, right? So in the early 2000s, I don't remember how this happened, but I got Manning wanted me to write a book on JAAS. You remember that? The Java Authentication and Authorization Service.
Oh
And
dear
so
God.
and I think if you go to jazzbook.com, jasbook.com, you can actually see it all now. But so I wrote the book, and and I mean this generally. It was a fun experience writing a book. Like I like writing stuff and doing things like that and coming up with the code. And then so we got to the tech review part, and maybe I have a bit of fond remembering, but most of that, there were like 3 tech reviewers, and pretty much all of them were like, "Yep, this is fine. Like it explains the stuff, but I wouldn't pay $50 for it, right?"
Right.
And that was the issue, is like, and I think that's still the case, that like a tech book basically costs $50, $40 or $50, right? And it's kind of the length of it and the cost, and like it just doesn't like that's a lot of money to pay for a book, and I guess if you're like a young single person, like what do you care? You just spend money, like when I bought all these books. But as you get older, you're like $50, that's ridiculous. And so like the new Kingmakers is a good example of like, sure, I'll pay $5 for this, right? Like, and I don't know, like, and given the small amount of money that authors of tech books make, like it seems like they'd be perfectly fine to just sell it for $5 or $10, and like that pricing is a lot more rational for I don't know. As someone who doesn't know anything about the business of books, seems to make a lot more sense, especially if it's like, I would almost pay for a book, unlike the speech that I'm giving, I would pay extra money for it to be shorter. To the point.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, and the other thing is these days, I think if I wanted to go deep into some topic, I wouldn't write a book. I'd make an app and have it be more interactive, be able to. I guess the problem is that people understand the format of books, but I sense that, did you ever read Al Gore was sort of like an app book on the environment or something? But
No.
I just think that I think the book format is kind of, even though it's well known, I think there's much higher bandwidth ways to sort of solve the problem that the book solves.
Well, it's quickly turning into the book episode appropriately, I guess. But like that reminds me of
And with O'Reilly, it should be the book episode.
Yeah, one of the books I read recently was this book, Escape Velocity by Jeffrey Moore. The Crossing the Chasm guy, and this book is all about. So if you're a gigantic big tech company, how do you make sure that you don't die? Like how do you reinvent yourself? I mean, I'm going
continuously.
Yeah, and I think from that perspective, it was an excellent book. Like it was still written at the level of detail that you get from tech business books, right? Which is whatever. But what was interesting about it is I of course read the ebook, but after every major section, there was like a 5-minute video of Jeffrey Moore. Maybe no, it was before whatever. In between each section was a video of Jeffrey Moore in 5 minutes, kind of just like lecturing about. He was doing that style, this one where they were like, look off, don't look at the camera, and he's like explaining it like this. So, anyways, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we should do our whole podcast like that.
That's right. Like,
drive me nuts.
So what is enjoyable about this format is that before the reader encounters it, they are given a different medium to structure their mind and understand and think about what they're about to read. So I'm giving them a 5-minute pitch, and it kind of like tells them what they're about to read, gives them some detail, and then they read 30 to 50 pages over what I've just talked about. And so I found that like my retention of what was happening in that book, in addition to his very like clear businessy writing, like when I would watch those videos, then I would, over the course of several days, read the next section, and I would like remember much better everything you had talked about. And so your point, like I think having more of a, as we used to call it back in the old days, multimedia approach to books would be awesome, right? And since reading that book, I've read lots of business books where I was like, man, I would really like the 5-minute summary video at this point to like help hammer home what I just read.
Yeah, and I know Apple is like with their iBook stuff, they have some pretty rich multimedia capabilities. Like for the textbooks, like I bought a biology textbook just to see what it was like. It's really cool. But I don't think that's the right approach. I think the right approach is just say, screw the book, do an app, and if there's long kind of parts of text, great. But then also incorporate the video, the audio, even interactivity like games and stuff.
Yeah,
it's all about the comprehension.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing that does drive me crazy about the Kindle is like I constantly, because I basically like am a blogger, I guess. Like I'm constantly like reading passages in there that I want to like blog. like just little quotes of it, and you basically can't do that. Like there's really, I found where the loophole is. At least on the OS 10 desktop Kindle app, you can cut and paste, but I never am reading there, right? So like I always want to be on my phone. This is not the universal symbol for on my phone, but I always want to be on my phone and like just, oh, this is a great passage, and just like blog it and put a link to buy the book, right? But like they don't really want you doing that at all, which whatever, I understand.
Well, that's funny because iBooks works exactly the opposite. You can copy and paste significant chunks of text, and at the end it just does the attribution with a link back to the iBook store.
Huh. Well, maybe I need to switch over to the iBook. I'm such like a Amazon fanboy that I probably will never do that. But like, yeah.
You chose the wrong team.
Yeah. What are you gonna do? Lock in. That's what lock in is. Yeah. So you'll have to tell us next time the stuff that isn't under DA, whether it's friend or drink, like what goes on at O'Reilly at Foo Camp there. That'll be fast.
Yeah, it's usually pretty clear, and usually if somebody says something really interesting, you just say, hey, can I talk about that, or publicly or whatever. Almost always the answer is yes.
So you said you went there like 2 years ago. So do you find, is there some particular role or sort of like position you find yourself playing or think you'll be playing? Do you think you'll be like the enterprise guy or what? Or the design guy? Like how if you were to pigeonhole yourself, what pigeonhole do you think you'll crawl into?
Well, I guess like I said a few times, I'm not really that extroverted in these sorts of audiences. So the first thing is I have to really try to force myself to say anything, because I'd be happy. I would be perfectly happy to not say a single word the whole weekend and just absorb like everybody else's good thoughts. But you'll
be like a brain vampire, just eating down all the information.
Right, but that's not the expectation. So the expectation is that you actually make in the spirit of Unconference, is a contribution. So I'll basically go to sessions that I think I guess there will be two things. There will be sessions where I know nothing, but I want to learn something, and some sessions where I think I can make some kind of contribution. And for the latter ones, I'll try to force myself to interject a useful thought or two.
Well, maybe you can discuss like DevOps. Do you think that'll come up?
Well, actually, I was just I don't know if we'll do it, and this probably isn't or NDA or FriendDA, but I just saw that some of my friends are going to be here, like Steve O'Grady and Rafe Coburn and John Allspaw, and I pinged Allspaw and asked him, because we've been kind of having this background thread discussion about sort of how do you adopt DevOps culture in a place that doesn't naturally have it. Like he had to do it at Etsy to some extent. I've had to do it at IBM, and so we were just kind of texting and saying, hey, maybe you should do a talk on sort of, what's it like to adopt DevOps cultures in these different contexts.
That would be great. You should put together a talk that's sort of like deploying DevOps in a hostile environment.
Right, but it's fun because like Etsy's obviously much smaller than IBM.
Yeah.
That sort of introduces its own set of problems, whereas IBM's so huge and introduces a different set of problems. So it's been really fun talking to them about this topic, because there's some points that are completely the same, and then other points which are very different.
So what's been your experience of like introducing it into a hostile environment?
That's not really, well, I don't know if I'd call it hostile.
I know, but it's just catchy. It's like speaking of books. So the last fiction book that I read was that book The Martian, right? Which is great. I don't know if you read it, but it's a fun book to read, and it's sort of like, it's basically there, not to give too much away, but there's this astronaut trapped on Mars, right? And he's got to survive like way beyond the capacity of all the supplies he's been given, and it just sort of highlights, survival in the hostile environment of Mars requires lots of ingenuity and hacking. And similarly, right, like if you're deploying a new thought technology, if you will, like DevOps, into an environment that isn't sort of like built to make that easy, you've got to figure out all sorts of hacks and ways around it. Or, the environment might be forgiving and ask how it can help, but often like you've got to figure out how to work with it and, wangle around, if you will.
Yeah, actually, the thing that's been bugging me most lately has been sort of at at a big company like IBM, there's the people who actually do the work, then there's the middle managers, then the senior executives and stuff like that. And at some point it seemed like the middle managers and the senior executives' lack of buy-in was one of the key blockers. But recently, one of the big problems I've seen is that at the actual doer level, like the developer, sysadmin or whatever, they really miss the whole point of DevOps.
Mm.
So, like for instance, I ran into somebody the other day from IBM, and DevOps came up, and he said, "Oh yeah, my group's adopting DevOps." And I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And he said, "We're adopting, Tool X, like continuous deployment Tool
Right.
X." And then, he proceeded to talk about how his product manager sucked and his designer was an idiot and stuff like this. And of course, one of the whole points of DevOps is empathy across disciplines, right? And like sort of breaking down the silos and kind of being empathetic about each other's goals, even understanding each other's tasks. If you're a developer, maybe you actually contribute to monitoring, or if
Yeah.
you're a sysadmin, maybe you actually write some deployment code that better puts the app in the environment in a better way, more stable way, or something. And it's just so frustrating that a lot of people think it just means adopt continuous deployment. Like
Yeah.
before somebody manually installed my app, and now I have a script that does it, and so I'm doing DevOps, and it's
Yeah. Well,
just really
I mean,
frustrating.
it's. I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but it's a lot like Agile introduction used to be, right? Where there were and I is this the case? I would say that like starting with XP and even going to Scrum and other stuff, like doing Agile software development, it could be even more prescriptive and tools based than DevOps, right? Like DevOps is pretty good at not being pretty good and pretty bad and technologies and tools you can pull out. But like, for example, I mean, the Extreme Programming book was basically like, do these 20 things. Like it was extremely prescriptive, and as far as also doing unit tests and all these things. And I remember these same conversations happening and me being involved in them back when I did real work, where people would be like, oh yeah, we do Agile, we have story cards. But there was sort of like the spirit of it all was missing, if you will.
Right? I guess that's the whole cargo cult thing. But to give credit where credit is due, did you ever read Kent Beck's book? Back to the book topic, Extreme Programming Explained.
Yeah, I think I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that one was really good because he actually had this taxonomy of like values, principles, and practices. And
Yeah.
so at the practices levels, it was like write unit tests before you write your functional code. But I mean that was part of a whole value framework. That I can't remember if it tied back to the Agile Manifesto, but if not, it was something very similar to the Agile Manifesto. And that's a real thoughtful way of thinking about why do we want to work this way, as
Yeah.
opposed to, oh, we're doing DevOps because now we use Chef.
Yeah. No, and I think that's almost like to be uber abstract, if you will. That's almost like this gets back to the discussion we had like last episode about what design is, right? And it's sort of like one of the more like advanced concepts you have to learn in programming is to always ask why you're doing something. And that sounds really like cheesy or whatever, but it was, you had an example of this earlier, like, oh, we're doing continuous integration, and those designers and product manager people are idiots, which is sort of like what you're misunderstanding there is like the tools just sort of allow us to focus on what's important, right? And what's important is that we're all working together on a team to design, then write, and then deploy and run a tool that our end users are going to use to like make their life better, to accomplish some task or whatever it is. But like part of what you're engineering is not only like I can write a really good string tokenizer or whatever this code is that you're doing. Like that's fine, but part of the engineering task, and I think what makes it engineering versus like science, if you will, is you're trying to solve a human problem with technology. And like a lot of that is sort of like you have to know how to manage this team and do all sorts of things above just like using a tool, right? Like just sticking a tool in to do some process, whether it's like parsing a file or like building your code isn't really going to do anything. You like that just frees up your time to worry about all this human concern stuff. And I think people always lose sight of that. And it is difficult because reading a book that goes over that is really boring. Right? Like it's really hard to read some sort of platitude of like all the stuff we're gonna do, and you're just like frustrated and out of time and just like no, just tell me something to do. And so that's why I think you need sort of like the original XP book and then the XP explained book, where it's sort of like, hey, look, just do this stuff and then we'll talk in a month, right? And then you'll
Right.
kind of understand like the bigger context that we're operating in. But just start these It's healthy habits, and then we'll talk about all the philosophy crap, if you will.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier episode about how one of the approaches that John Allspaw uses with the DevOps adoption is to just say, make it so you can deploy your app 10 times a day. And the nice thing about that approach is that it's extremely concrete and it's fairly easy to explain the value of it to a developer. But it's not like, in order to actually do that, you actually have to walk backwards into the cultural issues. Like, what if your system admins say, you can't auto-deploy your app, we have to do it for you, and we're going to do it manually, and you have to open a ticket, and we can do it maybe once every 2 days. If you can explain the business value of being able to auto-deploy 10 times a day, then hopefully it would drive a conversation where you understand their concerns and address them, and they understand your goals and support you. But it all comes back to the empathy. Actually, Mike Lukides from O'Reilly wrote an article, What is DevOps, like 2 years ago, and he's working on a new version of the article that I think he's going to launch around velocity time, and hopefully I'm not stealing any thunder, but it's really focused on the empathy aspect of DevOps.
Yeah, that'll be exciting.
It's a really tough one because, like you said, be empathetic. Okay, great. I gotta fix a bug.
Yeah, well, it's like, to shift to another area, right? It's like when you go to the doctor and they're like, you know what you should do? You should eat more whole grains and vegetables and fruits. And you're like, thanks. I'm glad I'm paying for this advice, right? Whereas really, like, we all know you should be better, right? Like no one's going to start their book off as like, you know what you should do? You should perform worse. Right? Like the end goal is to be worse. And so that's why when it comes to, like, at least for the way that someone that I'm kind of minded of, and I think a lot of software people are minded of, right? Like the way they like to learn something is they want to know some very tactical quick wins that they can do that allows them to almost understand why the big picture stuff matters. So that's like, for example, like the weird type of diet that I eat, that kind of like 4-hour body Tim Ferriss thing, is like, it's similar to like, just get to the point you're doing 10 deploys a day, right? And that diet begins with like, here's what you do. 6 days out of the week, don't eat any carbohydrates or sugar. Right? Like,
it's very binary.
Yeah. He's just like, every meal, to put it another way, every meal you need to eat a protein, a vegetable, and beans for 6 days of the week. 1 day of the week, you can eat whatever you want. That's it. It's almost like, and there literally is, like, I read that book of his, but there's a blog post that he had. Speaking of books that the HBR article would be sufficient, you can read that blog post and that's it. It's simple, right? And if you really want to get into like the reasons and all this stuff, there's a whole book you can read and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think the genius of doing 10 deploys a day or start with small projects or whatever is like, you'll get all hung up on the background and the context, and you just need to go through like the tactics of doing something, and then it makes you want to like spend the time to learn the higher concept things, which is, I give this advice when I give DevOps talks and technology talks to people all the time, and it's I always feel bad giving it because it seems really like unhelpful
right.
and generic, but I'm always shocked that people, like, I see them like writing down this advice, right? Like, to me it seems like the normal thing you do, but I don't think people normally think of like getting almost comically small tasks to learn big things.
Right. And I think there's a real important role for people in leadership positions to play. Actually, I frankly didn't get the whole empathy point for a long time. Yeah, I guess that's interesting. It's one of those things that once you learn it, you never kind of go back. But I know I had this habit of like saying, so-and-so is an idiot. And, sometimes there are instances where somebody really truly is incompetent. But I think in a lot of
sure.
In a lot of other instances, I think it probably is that they had a conflicting set of goals. We all had the same big goal, like make more money or whatever, build great products. But we were, because of our disciplines and the focus of our disciplines, we were focused on a different set of different priorities for the same goals. Actually, I was just talking to Tim upstairs, and he was talking about the Phoenix Project. You ever read that book, The Phoenix Project?
Of course.
And do you remember the security guy in the Phoenix Project?
Yeah, he's my favorite. I love that guy. I make fun of him in my DevOps talk all the time. I'm like, being a former developer, I hate security people because they always prevented us from doing anything. And so I love seeing this guy go through a midlife crisis and have to shave his head and everything. It was
Right.
like, I loved it. And he comes out nice on the other end, but I think that subplot of the security guy is it's almost one of the most helpful subplots in the book if you think about it a lot.
Yeah, we should probably say what it is because we're discussing something we both understand, and maybe somebody who hasn't read the book doesn't. Basically,
how ironic.
Yeah, it's kind of a spoiler, but so there's this, but it's a key point. And you should still read the book anyway. The Phoenix Project by Gene Kim. So basically, there's this security guy who's just a total pain in the ass, and he's always on the developers' asses about fix this, fix that, because we're going to fail our audit and get in trouble. And everybody just hates him. And at some point, I forget what happens, but he has some sort of breakdown. And he comes back and he decides that his goal should be to help them rather than be the policeman.
Exactly.
And help them understand where the security awareness auditability, I can't really remember, actually leads to a better result that the developers can empathize with and get into. And it ends up turning into, a great interdisciplinary collaboration, whereas before it was purely adversarial just because of the point of view that each person had.
Yeah,
I think that's a wonderful book, and everybody should read it. But I think that sort of part of the book is really a great one to kind of understand the whole empathy point.
Yeah, no, and I mean there's two things about that the security guy subplot. I can't remember his name, but that's kind of irrelevant. But like one of them is it's an example of and I don't know, from every direction I had to learn this lesson, like, because I would try to apply it in my personal life to my peril and my professional life to my peril or benefit as well. But like when if you spent like decades, or even if you spent a lot of time programming, you develop this mindset of basically saying, whatever the entity is, whether it's a set of requirements, a computer, a person, a customer, you're like, you need to be very clear and tell me what you want. And then what I am going to do is I'm going to give you exactly what you asked for, right? And I'm going to be very true to what someone has said wants to happen. And so like you have this mindset and you can never like think outside of the box, if you will, right? So if, for example, with the security guy, he's like, I've got this 3-ring binder and it says we need to do all of these things. And my job is to make sure we do all of these things, right? My job is not to question the requirements or interpret them, or like my job is to enforce them because I can, the CEO is going to go to jail, blah blah blah, all this threatening crap, and then similarly, like he goes through this process, and I think in order not to be basically trollish assholes, like programmers have to go through this process of thinking like, well, that's not really your job. Your job is to sort into at least 2 buckets. Especially when it comes to security stuff. So here's all these security requirements. This bucket is a bunch of bullshit that you need to quarantine and isolate away from the main line of production. And then this bucket are like things that are actually going to help you, and you should do this. And then there's even a whole other third bucket of things that are sort of like, here's things that you should be doing that the requirements aren't telling you. And like I feel like the security guy goes through this like evolution where he understands like, oh, we've got these auditors, and their job is to like stop us from doing productive work. Like this is a cynical view of auditors, right? And so part of what I need to do is just like hold them off and satisfy their bullshit stuff. On the other hand, there are things that are very genuine that we need to satisfy, so I need to make sure we do these things. And then there's also this whole other thing that you were alluding to of like, here's positive side effects and how I as a security person can help the team write a really good product, if you will. And like it's until you do all 3 of those things, like you're basically just an ass.
Right.
Who keeps telling people no.
Yeah, I was back to the topic of sort of adopting DevOps and IBM. I'm not trying to name drop, but just to give credit where credit was due. I was talking to a guy named Matt Ellis this week, and Matt's job, his title's like VP of Architecture and Technology, but he sort of has all of the sort of the central functions, like he owns the process for software group and the IT for software group, the security for software group. But he comes from a development background, and we were talking about how in many ways the official process is incompatible with some of the goals of continuous deployment or whatever, because the process was written down with the assumptions of on-premise software that gets deployed or shipped once or twice a year. And one of the points Matt made, which I'd never really heard before, is that a lot of auditing is about, what did he say? Say what we do and do what we say. So it's not so much that they have a strong opinion on what the process should be, but that
Exactly.
you've got to document it and that you're using it. And so one of the exercises that we're going through is sort of kind of looking at some of the rules and actually extracting the goal of the rules and making sure that we can express it in a way that's compatible with continuous deployment. And
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a talk, and we should link to this. So Mike Rembetzi from Etsy, which kind of rhymes, he had this really great video talk on how does Etsy do one of those financial compliance things like
PCI
SOX,
and stuff like
something
that.
like that. But it was basically they didn't want to lose the interdisciplinary collaboration and they didn't want to lose the deployment automation. So they basically came up with an approach so that they could have the same deployment pipeline, but with exactly sort of one manual step where
Right.
a person who wasn't in the code could do the audit check, but they did not isolate the collaboration. So they still collaborated with the developers. It was simply, they weren't writing code. They were simply auditing the code. But anyway, it's a really great talk.
Yeah, no, and you summarized what I was struggling to express. Kind of that like third bucket of stuff is exactly what you're saying is um, fully understanding the intention and the why of some requirement or audit thing that you have, and then using that understand to question like an onerous way of implementing it, right? Like, and maybe that's the way of putting it is that like, I think that's kind of the epiphany the security guy goes through, and also again as a developer you have to go through at some point is sort of like every time I see a requirement or someone asking me to do something, I need to understand why they're asking me to do it and figure out if the way they want me to implement it is the best way or if there's a better way of implementing it, right? And that's part of the value that someone can provide is sort of like, well, sure, this is the way, the old system required us to do all of this stuff, but we are not working under those constraints anymore. So now we can do something different. And that's
Yeah,
like,
I think that must be some sort of fundamental human problem because it's the same exact thing with design. Like if you like, we had this situation recently where we had a table with stuff in it, and whenever anybody wanted to make an enhancement, the end of each row had like two buttons in it, and whenever somebody wanted to add an enhancement, they just said add another button to the table or to the rows, and you can imagine that over time you would have
yeah,
like 20 buttons in each row, and it's like, oh, well, the table metaphor is no longer the correct one. We should just have a summary view, and then you click into it, and then you get a full view of the thing, and you can have as many controls as you want. But the fundamental problem is that most people who don't have the design mindset can only map sort of solutions on top of the current solution.
yeah.
They don't take the step back and say, okay, given the new set of goals and the current set of constraints, what's the best approach to solve the problem?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, is there an analog to the idea of refactoring in the design world? Because like I think what you just described at the code level is if I remember the real definition of refactoring, people will use refactoring and rewriting synonymously, which is not really correct. Like refactoring is more like we're solving the same problem, we're just solving it in a slightly different way, if you will. There's a lot more nuance in that, but it occurs to me like what you're describing is so and it sounds like someone did this, but what you should do is like the solution isn't to add another button to that table. The solution is to reimagine what it is we're doing here, like how
Right.
we're laying this out. And so it seems like that idea of refactoring needs to have a notion in design where at some point you're like, oh, now we need to go back to design. And I guess you could just say redesign, but we need a fancier
Yeah.
term for it.
Yeah, and since you usually like to get abstract, I'll get abstract. Maybe the thing is that for anything that has a solution, whether it's a process or a visual design or a piece of code, maybe one of the things we just have to do is always periodically take a step back, think about the current set of goals and constraints, which are probably very different than the goals and the constraints that accreted over time, and just
Exactly.
kind of start from a clean slate. I think Apple does a really good job with that. I mean, I've always heard that their process is highly iterative, and even within a product cycle, they're willing to throw out, lots of work and start over. And Pixar as well, apparently, from what I've read.
So before we run out of time, why don't we acknowledge the extensive feedback and follow up we got from one of your buddies?
Yeah. So yeah, the ratio of people who tell me they listen to the podcast and like it to feedback has been very disappointing. But maybe that's just normal, and we have to have a much higher level of listeners before we get the 0.1% of feedback that becomes meaningful. But anyway, a good friend of mine named Josh Steiger, who I worked with at IBM in the mid-2000s on the early days of the Jazz platform, and then he quit and moved to Silicon Valley and has been doing startup stuff ever since. He listened to the podcast, and he sent me that, hey, I like it a lot. And I said, send feedback. So he sent a really nice long feedback email. And hopefully you have it in front of you because I read it 2 weeks ago. I can't remember all the points.
Yeah. No, so a couple episodes back we talked about the weird NDA at WWDC, and he was just kind of speculating himself that a lot of it is just kind of the mechanics of what do you call PR people? Press relation. That's interesting. Press relations or whatever. That it's basically just. It's going back to our security and audit conversation. It's just following the rules so that you kind of have a safety net of getting people in trouble if you want. So, one of the theories we had, and this is kind of confirmed. I haven't gotten to check this out, but if I remember, you can basically go watch any video from WWDC without logging in and registering, which is sort of like de facto means there's not an NDA, even if there is an NDA. But it's sort of just like, I don't know. He basically had some interesting. It's kind of the reverse of CYA, cover your ass, but it's just like gives you this net of enforcement if you want to use, and it does. I would expect, and it would be nice if they were less stringent about NDA stuff because it just seems kind of ridiculous, and I'm not really sure what's helping them there. But anyways, it was interesting to get some input on that speculation. And then he gave us a story about early on in his career, kind of like assuming that designers were bozos, flipping the bozo bit. And he used a good example, which he cited quite a bit, that he assumed that Gmail was done by a bunch of programmers, but in fact, there was a lot of designer people behind it, which is an interesting note there. So that they're actually and he was trying to make the point that we were making, that hey, programmers. Not actually designers are helpful. like if you involve them and talk with them, they're not all crazy nut jobs out there. Everything.
If you're empathetic.
That's right. Exactly. If you're empathetic. And then he also brought up, this is going back to books. He made reference to the that book Creativity Incorporated. Speaking of business books, from the Pixar CEO, and I still haven't he was the with a book like that, I'm always leery because I've read lots of business books, and they're not. Most of them are very bad, and so I thought, I always assumed the business book's going to be good. But there's been 3 people who've recommended this book, so I'll probably go read it. But I at least went to go listen to the episode of The Incomparable where they talk about it, and there were a lot of interesting lessons learned as far as creative process is the wrong word. What it really should be called is how to not suck in big companies, right? Which is an art and science all its own. That succeeding in being creative and innovative, or just getting a product out the door in a large group of people is like a discipline in itself. And it sounds like there's a lot of interesting anecdotes and truthiness, if you will, in that book from the overview. So I think that episode of The Incomparable is a good overview, and I'll have to go read the book and see if there's some nice things to extract out of it.
Yeah, I've actually been working through that one with the audiobook, and man, it is dense. He just drops knowledge on every page, and it's something you have to take in a chunk at a time because it's just so much knowledge being dropped. And one of the takeaways I had is that dude, and it seems like that culture they have at Pixar is freaking paranoid about failure. No, they're paranoid about problems arising, and it's really incredible.
Right.
And that's why that's one of the reasons that Syracuse likes him so much, because he's all about sure, the iPhone's great, but here's the 20 things that are still wrong with it. It seems like Catmull, the guy who wrote the book, and I think he's president of Pixar, or he was just always saying, okay, great, good job. Now let's look at all the things that are lurking that are going to eventually add up to kill us. And I should go through my highlights because I've been doing that thing where I hear something profound and then go to my book and highlight it. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was he talked about how people kind of understand and react to big bad events, but I should probably, I'll misquote it and I'll correct it in a future episode. But basically, the accumulation of small problems end up being just as harmful as big problems. But it's sort of like the boiling the frog thing. You just don't notice them unless you're paranoid
Yeah.
about looking for them and rooting them out. And that was
Yeah,
something
yeah.
I never really
It's
thought
sort
about
it's it's sort of like the ignoring the P and the P under all the mattresses. The PEA, not the PEE. The story of the
that.
princess and the P.
Right,
Although I guess ignoring the P in the mattresses could also have its perils as well.
right.
But yeah, no, that's interesting because what I was going to say is, from the reading and listening I've done about the book, one of the things that it almost, there's one of these areas of sort of like being a mature organization that you hear time and time again, and that's sort of like you should not be afraid to fail and discuss failures and like point things out and fix them, right? And that sounds like this wonderful utopia that I have almost never existed in a company, right? Where it's safe to be wrong and safe to get things wrong and encourage for the group to fix things, right? So and maybe, I don't know, you must have encountered this reading it already, but it's sort of like, so we worked on this story idea, and now I'm going to take it to a big group, and they're going to, like, it's not going to be right the first 50 times, and they're going to take it apart and say what's wrong and mix it around and everything. And at the end of that meeting, the fact that I didn't have it 100% or even 90% right the first time is not going to reflect poorly on me.
And I think
like
it all stems from the leadership because, I mean, a smart leader like an Ed Catmull or a John Allspaw, they know that failure is part of the creative process. And if you try to stifle all failures, you're just going to stagnate. So I think it starts with the leadership. They have to create that environment.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it has to be a very tops down thing, and it does. It reminds me of another anecdote that's like tangentially connected, and we should probably close out. But like those Atlassian guys, right?
Yeah, actually, one of my friends from Jazz is the VP development there now. John.
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah. Anyways, it's constantly like, I think. Let me speak from an outsider perspective. I think the myth, and by myth I mean whether it's true or not, but the kind of image of Atlassian really confuses the crap out of the world. And first, we don't even talk about that we have no salespeople part, right? Like, so that's one thing, is there's not like dedicated salespeople. But for example, they're always like rumored to be IPOing and working on IPOing and stuff like that. And there was their CEO recently, who's one of the founders, he was quoted in this article as saying like, yeah, we might IPO or we might not IPO. It kind of doesn't matter. We're just working on funding and on growing the business and doing things, which is sort of like not cool for a CEO to say of a company that's supposed to be IPOing, right? Because whenever you come to the public market, you've got to be all bravado and growth and all of this stuff. So you can't just kind of be like, yeah, I don't know, that'll just happen, but we're kind of doing fine here, whatever. And it's not that dismissive, but you have to be very careful in how you word these things. And so internally, we had this email thread of like, whoa, hey, look at this guy doing this. Like, that's kind of nutty. And it's funny, like, I read over it and I was like, wow, that's really refreshing to have this guy just like saying something honest. But on the other side of my head, like, I know it's like, it's not professional to do that. And in the same way that like, and that's why it's, as you said, a leadership issue, is like, it's not professional for like a leader to speak publicly. And that's kind of what they have to do, is not only speak internally, but publicly be like, oh yeah, that was kind of a bad idea. Like, we screwed that up a lot, but we fixed it eventually, right? And that's really hard to do, but I would love to work at a place where it's okay to like admit failure and screw things up. And because that's what I'm always like lusting after, is like, the way that I operate is very iteratively. Like, I want to just like throw a bunch of stuff out there and get feedback and then constantly like work on it and fix it, if you will. But I don't think that's the way most people operate most companies operate when they're creating things, and thus you get a lot of problems because you don't get input.
Yeah, on the bright side, it can be a competitive advantage, because I think those companies that can do that are going to learn faster and get better faster.
Yeah. All right. Well, we better wrap up so that Bill can get rested before he gets drunk, which is always advisable, and does all that stuff. Do you have anything you want to close out with? Any meta information we should go over for the show here, Bill?
Nope. Just 2 requests. Send more feedback and send ear pods.
That's right. And as far if you don't know our email addresses, you can always I'll give dedicated listeners a secret. I own lots of domain names, and I get every single piece of email that's sent to all of those domain names. So, for example, if you send an email to feedback@underdevelopment.io, I'll get it, or to underdevelopment@cote.io, I'll get it, or you're a screwball, stop talking so much at coteindustries.com, I will get it. So you can basically like it's almost a qualifying test for feedback. If you can figure out how to email us, then we would appreciate your feedback.
And we will read it on air.
And also I think it was Josh who had a good suggestion. We will go do some SEO maintenance so that when you Google for Under Development Podcast, you find the page, hopefully. And we're in iTunes. There's a feed you can go subscribe to, and we'll see everyone next time.